The sun rose brightly over the town of Okonjo, painting the roofs with golden light. The whole town was alive with excitement because it was the wedding day of Chima and Ngozi. The streets were filled with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh flowers. People dressed in their finest clothes, eager to witness the celebration. The church bells rang joyfully, and children danced as the drummers beat their talking drums. Inside the church, every seat was taken. The bride, Ngozi, looked radiant in her white gown, her smile wide and nervous. Chima stood at the altar, his heart pounding as he waited for her to arrive. Everyone whispered blessings and shared stories about how beautiful their love was. Then the crowd stirred. Heads turned toward the entrance. A soft gasp ran through the people like wind through tall grass. Chima's mother, Mama Neka, had arrived, but not in the usual bright wrapper or lace like the other mothers. She wore a long white wedding gown, simple but shining, with lace at the edges and a small veil over her head. People began to whisper among themselves. "Why would she wear a wedding gown?" one woman said, frowning. "Is she trying to compete with the bride?" another asked quietly. A few even laughed behind their fans. It was unheard of, a mother wearing such a dress at her son's wedding. But Mama Neka walked slowly down the aisle, her steps calm, her face soft with a quiet smile. She did not look embarrassed or proud. Her eyes were steady, her back straight, and her presence filled the room. She carried herself with a kind of peace that made some people lower their eyes, ashamed of their laughter. When she reached the front, she greeted the pastor with respect, bowed slightly, and took her seat among the family. Even the drummers paused for a moment before starting again, softer this time, as if the moment had changed something in the air. Chima looked at his mother and felt confusion rise in his chest. He had never seen that gown before. He wondered why she chose to wear such a thing. He wanted to ask, but it was his wedding day. He smiled instead and tried to focus on the ceremony. Still, his mind couldn't let go of the image of his mother sitting there, graceful and calm in white, like someone carrying a story that nobody else could see. Ngozi noticed too. She whispered softly, "Your mother looks different." Chima nodded. "Yes," he said, "but she looks happy." As the vows began, Mama Neka's eyes filled with quiet emotion. She watched her son and his bride exchange promises before God, and she smiled, not with pride alone but with something deeper. It was a smile that carried both memory and healing. Throughout the ceremony, people's curiosity grew. Some whispered still, but others began to feel that maybe her choice meant something. Her calmness seemed too deliberate, too peaceful to be just vanity. It was as if the white gown was not just a dress but a message. When the pastor asked for the parents to give their blessings, Mama Neka rose to her feet. Her gown caught the sunlight through the church windows, making her look almost like she was glowing. She placed her hand on her son's shoulder, her voice soft but steady as she said, "May your marriage be filled with truth, patience, and peace." The people listened, surprised by the strength in her tone. Her words carried weight, like someone who had known both love and loss. As the music played again and the church filled with song, Mama Neka sat down quietly. She looked around at the faces watching her and smiled to herself. She knew they did not understand now, but one day they would. The gown she wore held a story she had carried for years, a story of love that never happened, a promise broken long ago, and a heart that finally found peace again through her son's joy. The whispers in the crowd began to fade. Instead, people found themselves looking at her with quiet respect. Her presence brought a strange calm over the room. Even the bride's mother, who had frowned before, found herself nodding gently as if she, too, could feel something meaningful in that white dress. As the couple exchanged their final vows, Mama Neka closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For her, it wasn't just her son's wedding, it was her own moment of healing. The gown that once symbolized sorrow now shone with hope. By the time the ceremony ended, the same people who had whispered at the beginning now greeted her with admiration. "Mama Neka," one woman said, "you look beautiful." She smiled softly and replied, "Thank you, my dear." Sometimes a dress carries more than cloth, it carries a story. As the guests left the church and the drums echoed across Okonjo, everyone felt they had witnessed something special. They didn't yet know what it was, but they could sense that behind that white gown was a tale of strength, forgiveness, and a heart that had waited years to smile again. Mama Neka stood outside, watching her son and his bride step into their new life. The wind lifted her veil slightly, and for a moment she closed her eyes, feeling at peace with the past she had carried for so long. She knew her reason for wearing the gown would be told later, but for now, it was enough that her heart was free. That day her white gown was not a mistake, not pride, not foolishness. It was a symbol, a bridge between her broken yesterday and her healed today. And though no one yet understood, the truth sat quietly in her heart, waiting for the right moment to be told. The music filled the air and the pastor's voice rose above the crowd, but the whispers in the church never truly stopped. Everywhere Mama Neka went, people's eyes followed her. Her white gown shimmered softly in the light, its edges brushing against the tiled floor as she moved. To some it was beautiful, to others it was strange, even wrong. In one corner, two elderly women leaned close together, speaking behind their fans. "Did you see her dress? A wedding gown. At her own son's wedding?" one of them whispered. "It is shameful," the other replied. "A mother should know her place." The bride's aunt, a proud woman with a sharp tongue, crossed her arms tightly. "She is stealing the bride's light," she muttered, shaking her head. Her words spread quickly like a small fire among dry leaves. A few guests laughed quietly, others nodded, and soon, the hall was full of quiet murmurs that floated just below the music and laughter. But Mama Neka did not flinch. She sat calmly, her face peaceful, her eyes fixed on the couple at the altar. Every now and then she smiled, not at anyone in particular, but as if smiling at her own thoughts. The pastor cleared his throat and continued the ceremony, though even he stole a few glances in her direction. When the time came for the families to give their blessings, he hesitated for a moment. His eyes moved from the bride's family to the groom's side and stopped on Mama Neka. "Let us now invite the mother of the groom," he said slowly, "to bless the couple." The room grew quiet. The whispers stopped. All eyes turned toward her again. Mama Neka stood gracefully, the white gown flowing around her like a cloud. The fabric caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, giving her a glow that made some people gasp softly. She walked forward, her head high, every step measured and sure. Chima, standing beside his bride, felt his heart race. He had been thinking about it all through the ceremony. Why had his mother come dressed like this? What could it mean? He leaned forward slightly as she approached, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mama," he said softly, his eyes full of confusion and worry, "why are you dressed like this?" She stopped before him, her eyes gentle but firm. She reached out, her hand warm as it rested on his cheek. There was a deep tenderness in her touch, the kind that only a mother carries in her hands. "My son," she said softly, her voice steady and calm, "you will understand when the vows are over." Her words carried a quiet mystery, like a locked door that only time could open. Chima wanted to ask more, but something in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't sadness or pride he saw there, it was peace, mixed with a kind of strength that made him feel both curious and comforted. The pastor waited, watching her closely. The guests leaned forward, expecting something dramatic, maybe even embarrassing. But Mama Neka simply closed her eyes for a moment and began to speak her blessing. Her voice was calm, low, and full of emotion. "May your marriage be filled with patience," she said. "May you forgive quickly, speak truthfully, and love deeply. May your hearts never harden even when life becomes difficult." Her words rolled through the room like soft rain. The crowd, once full of whispers, now listened in silence. Even those who had judged her at first found themselves staring, their hearts strangely moved. As she spoke, the white gown seemed to take on new meaning, no longer a symbol of vanity or pride, but of purity, of something deeply personal. Her blessing wasn't just for her son and his bride, it felt like a prayer for herself too, for all the years she had carried unspoken pain. When she finished, she opened her eyes and for a brief second, they glistened with unshed tears. She stepped back quietly, her face still calm, and returned to her seat. The pastor nodded slowly, his earlier hesitation gone. "Thank you, Mama Neka," he said softly. "That was beautiful." The music started again, but this time it sounded gentler, softer. The whispers did not return. Instead, people began to look at her with new eyes, not of judgment but of quiet respect. Chima turned toward his bride and smiled faintly. He still did not understand his mother's choice, but he felt a sense of peace settle inside him. Something told him that whatever her reason was, it came from love, deep, honest love. As the ceremony continued, Mama Neka folded her hands in her lap and watched the two exchange their vows. Her thoughts wandered back through time, to her own youth, her own dreams, and a wedding that never happened the way she had once imagined. But she pushed those memories aside for now. Today wasn't about her sorrow. It was about joy, about letting go and blessing her son's new beginning. As the final song played, a small smile touched her lips again. The people around her still didn't know the meaning of the gown, but she could feel their eyes softening. And somewhere deep inside she knew the right time would come, the time when her story, the one hidden in that white dress, would finally be told. Until then she sat quietly, her gown shining softly in the light, her heart calm and full of peace. As the evening sun dipped lower in the sky, the wedding celebration bloomed with laughter, music, and color. The band played lively tunes, children danced barefoot on the dusty ground, and plates filled with steaming jollof rice passed from hand to hand. But beneath the joy, whispers still floated like restless birds. People couldn't stop wondering why Mama Nneka had worn a wedding gown to her son's wedding. Some said it was pride. Others claimed she had lost her mind. Even those who had softened during the ceremony still spoke quietly among themselves. She must have her reasons, one man said, but what kind of mother dresses like that? Mama Nneka sat calmly at her table, smiling at the laughter of the newlyweds. Yet deep inside she felt the quiet pull of old memories, memories she had kept hidden for many years. She had promised herself that one day she would speak the truth. And as she watched her son hold his wife's hand, she knew that day had finally come. When the music slowed, she stood. Her gown caught the light again, glowing softly as she walked to the center of the hall. The murmur started instantly. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. "Is she going to speak?" Mama Nneka reached for the microphone. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. The noise in the hall slowly faded until only the sound of her breathing could be heard through the speakers. "My children," she began, her voice low but firm, "today is not just a wedding for you to remember. It is a day of truth, a day that belongs to love in all its forms." The guests fell silent. Some leaned forward. Even the drummers put down their sticks. She looked at her son, then at his bride. Her face softened and she smiled. "Many years ago," she continued, "I had this gown made for my own wedding day. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever owned. I had saved every coin, worked every day in the market just to afford it. I dreamed of walking down the aisle with joy in my heart." Her voice trembled slightly, but she went on. "The day before the ceremony, my husband-to-be left me. No warning. No explanation. Just a letter saying he had found another woman. I cried for days, maybe weeks. My mother told me to burn the gown, to throw away the memory. But I couldn't." She took a deep breath and placed her hand gently over her chest. "I didn't keep it to remember pain. I kept it to remember strength. I wanted to remind myself that love, real love, never dies because of one broken promise. It lives on when we forgive, when we choose hope over bitterness." The hall was completely quiet now. Even the sound of the wind outside had faded. She looked down at the gown she wore, then lifted her head proudly. "Today I wear this gown not as a bride who was left behind, but as a mother who has seen love rise again. My son stands where I once fell. His joy fills the space where my sorrow used to live. That is why I am dressed in white, to celebrate love's return, not to relive my pain." Her words rolled through the air like a soft breeze. People who had judged her moments ago now felt a lump in their throats. A few women wiped their eyes quietly. Even the bride's aunt, who had criticized her earlier, lowered her gaze. Mama Nneka smiled gently and turned to her son. "Chima," she said, "you are wearing the ring I never got to exchange. You are the second chance I never had. I prayed that when love came for you it would stay, and today I see that prayer answered." Chima felt his eyes fill with tears. He stepped forward, took his mother's hand and kissed it softly. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaking, "thank you. You've carried this pain alone for so long." She shook her head. "Not pain, my son," she said with a small laugh. "It was never pain after I found peace. I learned that the heart heals faster when it loves again, not another person but life itself." The bride, Ngozi, reached out and hugged her mother-in-law tightly. "Mama," she said softly, "you are the most beautiful bride this day." Laughter spread through the hall, not mocking laughter but warm and genuine. The air felt lighter. Even the musicians, moved by her words, began to play softly again, their drums echoing with a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of everyone listening. As Mama Nneka handed the microphone back to the pastor, he smiled at her with deep respect. "You have taught us something powerful today," he said. "That love never truly ends, it only changes its path." The guests nodded. The whispers were gone, replaced by quiet admiration. Women looked at her with tears in their eyes, remembering their own heartbreaks, their own strength. Men bowed their heads, moved by her courage. Mama Nneka returned to her seat, feeling lighter than she had in years. The music rose again and the people began to dance, not just for the bride and groom but for her too. Some guests came to greet her, their words full of gratitude and awe. "You have blessed us today," one woman said. "Your story will not be forgotten." As the night deepened and lanterns glowed softly in the courtyard, Mama Neka watched her son and his bride dance together. Their laughter filled the air like sweet music. She rested her chin on her hand, smiling to herself. For so long that white gown had waited in a wooden box, silent, untouched, but alive with memory. Tonight it had finally found its purpose. It wasn't just a dress anymore. It was a symbol of endurance, of healing, of a love that had transformed through time and pain. And as the stars began to shimmer above Okonjo, Mama Neka closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself, "I have worn it at last, not for the wedding I lost, but for the love that found its way back home." The room grew still as Mama Neka's words settled deep into the hearts of everyone present. For a long moment nobody spoke, not even the drummers who had been filling the air with rhythm. Then Chima slowly rose from his chair and walked toward his mother. His eyes were wet, his steps unsteady. When he reached her, he knelt down beside her, ignoring the whispers of surprise that moved through the crowd. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Mama," he said looking up at her, "you carried so much pain, yet you still gave me love. You gave me a life filled with warmth, laughter, and courage. I never knew what you went through." Mama Neka smiled softly. Her wrinkled hand touched his head, resting there gently as if she were blessing him all over again as she had when he was a child. "That is what mothers do," she said quietly. "We take our pain and we turn it into strength for our children. Love must continue even when life tries to break it." Her words struck deep in everyone's hearts. The crowd fell silent again and even the air seemed to listen. Ngozi, the bride, stepped forward with tears glistening in her eyes. She reached for Mama Neka's other hand and held it tightly. "Mama," she said, her voice soft but full of feeling, "your gown is not strange. It is holy. It carries faith. Today it has blessed our home." At those words, the people began to clap softly, their applause building slowly like the rise of a gentle storm. Some women covered their faces with their hands as tears rolled down. Others nodded with respect. The men who had once whispered with doubt, now looked at Mama Neka with deep admiration. The music resumed quietly in the background, not the loud, joyful drums from before but a slow, tender melody. It carried the weight of love, loss, and healing. Mama Neka looked at her son, then at Ngozi. "You see," she said, "when love breaks it does not mean God has left. It only means He is giving you another chance to build something stronger. That gown," she looked down at herself, smiling faintly, "used to be a reminder of sorrow. But now it is a sign of what survived." Chima wiped his tears and stood, helping his mother to her feet. He hugged her tightly, a hug that spoke more than words ever could. "Mama," he whispered, "you never told me you still had this gown." She laughed softly. "I wanted to tell you when you were older, when your heart could understand. I didn't want you to see it as a story of pain but as a story of hope." The bride's aunt, who had criticized Mama Neka earlier, now walked forward shyly. She bowed slightly. "Forgive me," she said. "I spoke wrongly about you. I thought your gown was pride, but now I see it is power." Mama Neka shook her head kindly. "You have nothing to ask forgiveness for," she said. "We all learn in our own time. What matters is that we see the truth before it's too late." The audience clapped again, louder this time. Even the pastor, who stood near the altar, wiped his eyes. "Mama Neka," he said, "your strength has preached a sermon more powerful than any words I could have spoken today." The laughter that followed was warm and light. The people began to smile again, not out of amusement but from relief, the kind that comes when pain turns into peace. Mama Neka sat down once more, surrounded by her family. Little children gathered near her, curious about her shining white gown. One small girl touched the hem and asked innocently, "Mama, are you a bride too?" Everyone laughed gently, but Mama Neka leaned toward the child and said, "Yes, my dear, every mother is a bride to life. We marry our hearts to love and never let go." Those simple words echoed in the air, touching every ear, young and old alike. The laughter turned into quiet reflection. Chima stood beside his mother, his hand on her shoulder. "Mama," he said softly, "I will tell my children this story one day, how you wore white not for yourself but for love that survived. They will know that real strength is not loud. It is quiet but it lasts." She smiled, her eyes glistening under the soft evening light. "That is all I want, my son. For the story to live, not as sadness but as light." The wedding feast continued, but something had changed. The celebration no longer felt like a show, it had become a gathering of hearts. The music now carried meaning, and every dance step seemed to honor her story. Somewhere in the back, an old woman turned to her neighbor and said, This is what true grace looks like, a woman who wears her past not to boast but to bless. And indeed, Mama Neka's gown shone like a quiet flame. It was no longer just cloth stitched together years ago. It had become a living symbol, of love's endurance, of motherhood's strength, and of the beauty that pain can leave behind when it is met with peace. When the night drew to an end and the last song faded, Mama Neka rose once more. Her steps were slow but steady, her smile calm and sure. She looked up at the sky, where a single bright star blinked, and whispered, "It is finished. The gown has found its day." Her son and daughter-in-law stood beside her, holding her hands, their hearts full. And for the first time in years, Mama Neka felt completely free, not because her sorrow was gone, but because it had finally been turned into something beautiful. The people who left that night carried her story in their hearts, telling it again and again, about the mother who wore a wedding gown not for vanity, but for victory, not for her past but for her peace. The story of Mama Neka spread far beyond the small town of Okonjo. People who once whispered behind her back now spoke her name with admiration and respect. The memory of that wedding day, the day she walked into the church wearing a white gown, stayed alive in every home, every market, and every gathering. Women, especially the younger ones, began visiting her house often. They came not out of curiosity but because they wanted to learn from her strength. Her little compound soon became a quiet place of wisdom, filled with laughter, stories, and the scent of palm soup always cooking in the background. Mama Neka would sit under the old mango tree with her wrapper tied around her waist, the famous white gown folded neatly in a box beside her. She never hid it away again. To her, it was no longer a reminder of the man who left, it was a story of how she survived. "Tell us, Mama," one of the young women would ask, "why didn't you throw the gown away after all that pain?" Mama Neka would smile, her eyes full of light. "My daughters," she would say, "clothes do not bring shame when they carry love. This gown was made in sorrow, but it lived to see joy. What we carry in our hearts is what gives meaning to what we wear." Her words always made the girls sit quietly, thinking deeply. Some would nod, others would wipe their eyes. There was something about her voice, calm, sure, full of grace, that made her stories feel like songs of healing. Even the older women came to her sometimes. They had once judged her, called her strange for wearing that gown. Now they came with humility, seeking her advice about their children, their marriages, and the weight of time. She never turned anyone away. "We all make mistakes," she often said. "But God gives us many chances to turn pain into purpose. What matters is that we do not let our hearts stay bitter." The people of Okonjo slowly changed. Gossip was replaced with gratitude. Women encouraged one another to find strength in what they had survived. Men began to respect the quiet wisdom of their wives and mothers a little more. At every wedding that followed, someone always mentioned her name. "Remember Mama Neka," they would say. "She wore her wedding gown to her son's wedding, not for pride but for peace." It became a saying, one that carried the power of forgiveness and hope. Even years later, when her steps grew slower and her hair turned completely white, children still ran to her house to listen to her stories. They loved the way she spoke, the way she could turn sadness into something beautiful. She told them not to be afraid of broken dreams. "Some dreams," she would say softly, "do not die. They simply wait for the right time to shine." One afternoon she brought out the gown for the last time. It was no longer bright white, but its beauty had not faded. She laid it carefully across her lap and looked at it with a smile. "You have done your work," she whispered. "You waited many years and when the time came you brought peace." Chima and Ngozi often came to visit her. They would sit by her side, listening to her stories and watching how her eyes still sparkled with life. "Mama," Ngozi said once, "I want to teach my daughters to be like you, patient, forgiving, and brave." Mama Neka laughed softly. "Teach them to be true first," she said. "If they are true to their hearts, everything else will follow." Sometimes on quiet evenings the people of Okonjo would walk past her house and hear her singing. It was always the same song, a soft tune about love that endures and wounds that heal. Her voice floated through the air like a gentle breeze, carrying comfort to anyone who listened. When she passed through the market, women greeted her with joy. "Mama Neka," they would call. "Our bride of peace." She would laugh, wave her hand and say, "Ah, my children, it is love that made me shine, not the gown." Her humility only made people love her more. She had turned what could have been a story of shame into a story of strength. Years went by, and when Chima and Ngozi had children of their own, they brought them to her every Sunday. The children would sit around her, eyes wide with curiosity as she told them the story again, the story of the wedding gown that waited years for its moment. And every time she reached the end she would smile and say, "Remember, my children, beauty does not come from what we wear, but from the love we carry." As time moved forward, her story became part of the town's history. Mothers told it to their daughters. Pastors mentioned it in their sermons. It reminded everyone that grace is not found in perfect lives, but in hearts that choose peace over bitterness. Even after Mama Neka grew too old to walk far, her presence was felt everywhere. Her wisdom had become a seed planted in the hearts of her people. One evening, as the sun set golden over Okonjo, she sat quietly by her window. The white gown hung nearby, glowing softly in the fading light. She looked at it one last time and whispered, "Now I see, it wasn't meant for a wedding of two. It was meant for a wedding of hearts, where pain and peace finally meet." And from that day on, whenever people spoke of her, they said with deep respect, "She wore her wedding gown to her son's wedding, not for pride but for peace." The gown that once waited in silence had found its purpose. And Mama Neka's story lived on, teaching everyone that love may delay, pain may last, but hope always finds its day to shine.